This is a story about Troy. It's about the conflict in Troy. It's about the prince of Troy, Helenus, the younger brother of Hector, the high priest of Artemis first, Apollo, her brother, second. So he was high priest of Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, the goddess of the hearth, later. Apollo, the sun god, who's not a god of the sun, but if he is the god of the sun, he's the son of the god of the sun. Zeus is the god of the sun, and the sun is Apollo, and Apollo is the son of the sun god, and the father god is Zeus. So Helenus was not a high priest of Zeus. He was not that he would go against Zeus's will, but he was actually Zeus's son. Apollo and Artemis he was actually a high priest of Artemis. His sister was a high priest of Apollo, but he was also a high priest of Apollo also. So he literally was in Apollo's temple, not Artemis's temple. But he was specifically a high priest of Artemis. Now, Artemis, I'm going to say, was destroyed or died or put out of the picture early on, and even before the war started. So that's a different story, though. This story is about Helenus and how he's not guilty of betrayal, how he didn't betray Troy. The story says that he may have backstabbed Troy or betrayed Troy. It's important that he gets his say, that he has his moment to defend himself and what really happened. It's important that Helenus gets to defend his spirit of his honor, of who he represents himself to be. He is a dedicated, loyal high priest of Artemis and Apollo, who are maybe dead gods. They're dead. They've been destroyed. So Apollo and Artemis may have lost their lives. And if they're still alive, they're hiding. They're not coming out. So it's very likely Apollo's dead, the sun god is dead, and also Artemis is dead. And ultimately, Apollo and Artemis still live in the collective of human thinking, thought, spiritual thinking, in the spirit. So the human collectives still have Apollo and still have Artemis. But Artemis and Apollo are living in the humans' collective memory and thinking, spiritual process. So the collectives are not the gods themselves. There's no godhead anymore. They got removed, which means that the only part that's left of Apollo and Artemis is the people that had their spirit and took it. Well, when they lost their god bodies because they got destroyed, their god bodies got killed. I think Zeus did it. So I think, but that's a different story. I'm not going to talk about that. And I could be mistaken, but I think Zeus allowed it. I don't mean he did it. He allowed it to happen because of the story. But I'll talk about that later because I want to. This is a story about how important it is to defend Helenus and what he represents. Now, first of all, when you read the mythology, you'll read that about Helenus becomes king of the land. Helenus survives the war supposedly, and he ends up marrying Hector's wife. Hector's baby was killed, thrown off. 2-year-old baby was killed by the Achaeans. They threw him off the walls, chucked him. Basically, they murdered everybody. And Hector wasn't even there to defend his wife and kid. He'd already been killed by Achilles. And Troy was sacked. Helenus was already gone from Troy. But the story says that Helenus was taken captive and he was a slave to the son of Achilles for things he did in honoring Achilles. And he got mad at Paris big time because Paris tricked Achilles in the temple. Achilles thought he was coming to marry somebody, and ultimately it was a friendly engagement. But Paris had a trap set for Achilles when he came to the temple, and they killed him with a poison arrow. Ultimately, Paris killed himself for it afterwards. And so then Achilles was dead, and Paris was dead. And Paris tried to burn Achilles' body and let it get eaten by the birds and the dogs. And ultimately, some other guy too, Polydermus, or I can't remember the name, but Helenus would not. Helenus freaked out, said, "No, you're going to give the body back to the Achaeans." So Helenus intervened as a prince of Troy against Paris, who was also a prince of Troy. And Helenus was a seer and also a high priest of Apollo and Artemis. And he also was a quote unquote a high priest of Minerva. So understand that his being a high priest of Minerva was not really a good thing, because ultimately Minerva betrayed him. And so the story goes that he survived, and they have big long stories about what happens to him after the war and everything. And he survives, and he carries on the line of Troy. Helenus does. Now that may be true, that he carries on the line of Troy. Somehow he did. But whether he had kids before and he died, but the story I have is he didn't even survive. So what I'm going to tell you is Helenus didn't survive. He didn't become a king, and the story says he did. The story says that he survived. He was the only one of the Trojans to carry on the Trojan line down the line. That's all probably true. But it wasn't from Andromache. So whatever baby he had, it wasn't from Hector's wife. And now if it was, then understand the story I have has a very important connotation to it, which means that whether the story is true or not, it tells us something important. There's an important understanding to get from the story I tell. So if the story I tell is not true, well, it doesn't matter if it's not true. It is true. In spirit, it is absolutely true. So sometimes the story can be retold differently or seen to be untrue. But ultimately, what you're going to realize is when we're talking mythology, we're trying to understand the spirit of the humans and the mixture of gods and goddesses and the spirit of gods and goddesses that get into those humans. And the collectives, the masculine collective, the divine masculine, which is a collective and spirit of men and a feeling and a thinking and the mostly felt. So the collectives are felt by the whole group. And the masculine collective and the feminine collective. The feminine collective is a group of women who are in feeling one way, and it's very strong. So there's different collectives in spirit, like when groups of people are in those collectives. Helenus was a very dedicated, loyal little brother to his big brother Hector. So Helenus would be the little brother that didn't mind being a little brother, but he maybe didn't like it a lot. But he always respected his older brother Hector. And so he not only respected him, but he loved him. And he would do anything for him. He certainly wouldn't want to die for him, but he would try to live for him, and he'd certainly fight with him, and he did fight with him. So Helenus was a soldier that fought in the 3rd Battalion, in the Troy's 3rd Battalion. And he was already a high priest, and ultimately for a while he was being a soldier fighting with the 3rd Battalion with his brother. I can't remember the name of his brother that is also Prince of Troy. There was like 50 princes of Troy. So he was one of the younger ones. So he was like 10 years younger than Hector. Hector was his older brother, so almost like his dad. So Helenus looked at his brother like kind of like a father, and ultimately would do anything he said, and he followed his instructions explicitly, and was just very loyal. And Helenus was a man that had feelings and emotions and thoughts of concern and compassion for others, and he ultimately wanted the world to be okay, and he wanted everyone to be all right. He didn't want fights, and he didn't like seeing any kind of conflicts. He wanted to settle conflicts and stop conflicts, or try to make conflicts okay somehow. And he mediated between Minerva and King Priam and Hector. So King Priam and Hector were, Hector was the highest prince of Troy in line to be king after Priam. King Priam was the Trojan king of Troy, and Troy was the city of God. And basically they called that the city of God because the gods lived there. So not only did Apollo and Poseidon, the god of the sea, actually live in Troy, but they built the walls of Troy. It took a year, and they were humans while they did it. So basically, there was an attempted overthrow. Hera tried to overthrow Zeus. So they were already on shaky terms, meaning the whole entire gods of Olympus they had murdered Eris. So Athena had murdered Eris. Hermes got murdered by Athena. So Athena killed both Ares and Hermes. Those are different stories that I don't want to tell you about, but ultimately, because Helenus actually saw Hermes up on the mountain pass, dead, he didn't recognize who he was. He knew that it was someone important. He stared too long at the corpse of Hermes, the god, and he stared too long at the corpse. Meaning he went up to, he was on the mountain, Helenus was on the mountain. He was going to try to meet Diomedes and Odysseus. He was planning on, he was doing it for Minerva. So ultimately, Minerva had approached Helenus and had contacted Helenus. Helenus was a high priest of Apollo, the sun god, and Artemis, goddess of the hunt, but she became of the hearth later. And Helenus was not really the high priest of Zeus, but it was only because he was focused on doing the duties of Apollo, his son. So he would have done anything Zeus wanted, but ultimately he wasn't focused on following Zeus's will. He was following the Apollo and Artemis's will. Artemis is, if you want to talk about an order, it may be Artemis first, meaning that Helenus may have been literally a high priest of Artemis and also Apollo second. So his sister Cassandra was Apollo first, probably an Artemis second. So it was like a switch, like the man had the woman god and the woman had the man god, and Cassandra was the twin of Helen. So Helenus had a twin sister, Cassandra, who was cursed by Apollo. So no one would believe her prophecies, but Helenus was a prophet and a seer that was really good at it. He was one of the best. He knew the will of the gods, including Zeus's will. He knew not only what the gods wished for and wanted, but he was able to tell the Trojans what the gods expected and needed, and also would refuse or whatever their will was. Helenus was able to ascertain Zeus's will and explain it to Hector, his brother, and his dad, King Priam. So Helenus played an important role in the War of Troy. Now, he was injured by Menelaus by a spear that went through his hand and pinned his hand to his bow. So he was holding a bow, and he was trying to shoot an arrow at Menelaus. But Menelaus had a spear and hit him first. So Helenus was in the war for the first 7 years. And of the 10-year war, Helenus was in the battle for the first 7 years. He fought as a soldier and ultimately as a high priest. Secondly, he wasn't at the temple. He was in the Trojan ranks of soldiers living there, fighting with them every day, fighting with his brother Hector in the 3rd Battalion with his other brother Polydorus, or I can't remember his name. But there was lots of brothers, lots of Prince of Troy. Helenus was fighting, and he got injured when the spear went into his hand and pinned it, and it went into the bow. So the spear blade went through his hand and pinned his hand literally to the bow. So he couldn't drop the bow. The spear was literally locked, stabbed through so he had the bow in his hand locked, and the spear he was dragging. So he ran from the battlefield. He had to get out of there. He had to retreat. And he retreated with that spear stuck in his hand and into the bow, so he couldn't drop the bow nor the spear. He dragged the bow and the spear on his hand. They were attached, so they had to literally pull the spear out of his hand and out of the bow, and to free him afterwards when he got in the back ranks. His hand was mangled really bad, almost to where it was not even it was useless. So understand that he got injured in that engagement by Menelaus. His hand was useless. I think it was his left hand, and it got hit, and he was out of the war in the 7th year. He went now from the first 7 years, he went fighting with the Trojans as in the 3rd Battalion with his brother Hector. He fought right alongside him for 7 years. And ultimately, at the 7th year, when he got injured in his left hand, really mangled. Now it was useless. He wasn't able to fight anymore effectively. It was ultimately like, your hand's really screwed up. It's useless. You can't write with it anymore. Ultimately, yeah, he screwed his hand up so bad that he couldn't fight anymore, really. Or if he could, they said, you can't. So ultimately, Hector put him out as a soldier in the 7th year and said that you're going to go back to the temple of Apollo and be a high priest. So he went from being a soldier for 7 years into being injured, and then being suddenly a high priest now, out of the battle completely, not even fighting anymore at all. And so he wasn't with the 3rd Battalion anymore. He went back to the temple of Apollo at the beaches of Troy, or it was in Troy, beyond the walls now, because the temple of Apollo was sacked on the beaches. But he would be doing his duty as a high priest. Now, Minerva had contacted Helenus, and he was very, oh my gosh, it's a goddess trying to talk to me. So basically, like, when Minerva showed herself to him, she came to him as a goddess. Minerva, the real goddess, came to Helenus. Her presence was with him, came to him in his area right in front of him, and showed herself. And he couldn't believe it. So he was utterly just beside himself when he first saw Minerva. Now, his idea was, obviously, she came to him and she wanted to talk. She told him, I want you to deliver a message to your father, Priam, and Hector, your brother. So basically, he said, sure. He thought Minerva was awesome. He didn't know Minerva, but he absolutely knew who she was. And he also knew that she was the enemy. So she was the one trying to sack Troy with Hera, Minerva and Hera. So the will of Hera was the will of Minerva, and the Minerva was also had Mars. But not Zeus. And ultimately, Zeus was her dad, but she had Mars. She took Mars. So she was a mixture of Mars and Hera, masculine and feminine as a goddess. And Helenus was really just beside himself. When Minerva shows up to him as a goddess, he was honored. He was like, wow, a goddess is talking to me. Whoa, like, I can't believe it. And okay, hi. And ultimately, she says, I want you to deliver some messages for me, if you will. And ultimately, he said, I will. And so she had him deliver some messages. And over the dinner, he became really important suddenly overnight. He was already important as a good little brother that was just a great little fighter next to his brother, and was a servant and loyal friend. But when he got contacted by Minerva, and then Minerva asked him to be the messenger and go tell his Priam and Hector some messages, he got to sit at the dinner table and be in a whole different position. He was now important, and suddenly his brother Hector was like, wow, you're delivering messages from Minerva. And he didn't really even believe him almost. It's like, Minerva, you saw Minerva the goddess. Like, yes, she talked to me. I saw her. She's real. Ultimately, he knew she was real. Hector knew she was real, but Hector would never have seen her. So he would have never had any indication that she was actually more real than any of us today. But she shows herself to some people, actually, and other people she didn't. But back then, she showed herself to a lot. The gods and goddesses showed themselves a lot more. And now most of them are dead now, which means they can't show themselves. They're only alive in the collective. So the human race is in many collectives of human spirit in different collectives, and the what's left of the gods and goddesses are in the humans. So the humans are the gods and goddesses, if there is anything left of them. They became human, and they're mortal now. They're dead. So a human is basically either a dead god or goddess, or has that dead god or goddess spirit, which means that the difference between a person that's actually like if Apollo, the sun god, is actually dead, and he's actually Apollo, the sun god, he died. He died because he challenged his dad, Zeus, and tried to go against his will, and ultimately tried to be his dad. And ultimately, Apollo got removed by the goddesses, though. Zeus didn't do anything to him. The goddesses tricked Apollo and killed him, but that's a different story. We're talking about Helenus now. Helenus was he didn't betray Troy whatsoever, and ultimately, when you read the story, it's disturbing because When I read the story, I thought, man, I can't believe that. I can't believe that any of that happened, because ultimately what I would tell you is my source told me. Well, I mean, God would tell me. I get like a narrator in my head telling me the real deal. So when I'm reading the story, there's a little narrator in my head saying, well, no, that didn't actually happen. It was something else. And then I get told, so I get the edit. I get to edit it in my mind to see what, so when I read the story, I actually get to told a different story completely than what the myth says. So I'm actually getting two stories. I'm getting the story that I'm reading on the page of the Iliad when I'm reading it, and I'm getting also a story of the narrator in my head, who's God supposedly, and he talks to me, he helps me understand. So uh, supposedly, he says that Helenus was captured by Diomedes and Odysseus, and he went there voluntarily to try to get away from Troy, and ultimately it had less to do with Achilles' death or the fact that Paris really did a bad deed by tricking Achilles. It was totally dishonorable of the Trojan prince Paris to trick Achilles into thinking you're going to temple to talk about getting married. So Achilles was completely tricked. He went to a temple. He didn't even have his weapons with him. He thought it was safe to go there without the weapons, and he didn't have his armor on. Ultimately, Achilles believed that he was going to the temple that was with the Trojans, but he also believed that they weren't going to try to do anything. So whatever made Achilles trust the Trojans and actually go to that temple, well, Achilles was not afraid of death, and he certainly wasn't afraid of the Trojans, which meant that it could have been just that he was too damn brave and fearless to even. He didn't go there with his weapon or armor. He thought it would be safe enough. If he got into a fight, it wouldn't be a bad one. But it turned out to be that Paris was in ambush, waiting for him with other Trojan fighters. So they ambushed Achilles and murdered him. Supposedly, that's why he went to get Achilles' son to come and ultimately kill Priam, his dad. So ultimately, the story says that Helenus ended up with Helenus knew in the seventh year when he got injured. It wasn't long after he was out of the battle. He was praying in the temples, praying. He was getting messages from Minerva. He was a messenger between Minerva and his brother Hector and Priam. Now he was really more important because he was literally being at the top with his dad and Hector, the general. So he suddenly became really important, and ultimately he felt really important because he trusted Minerva, who also acted like his friend. And ultimately Minerva had ultimately convinced him that Troy was doomed to fall, and ultimately it was going to get sacked. So basically, there was nothing they could do, and ultimately, Helenus believed that the Trojans were not following the will of Zeus anymore, or the will of Athena, and especially Athena. Helenus saw that the Trojans were disrespecting the goddesses, fighting them, Hera and Minerva, and also Athena. And Helenus had told Hector and Priam that if they fight Hera and Minerva, the goddesses Hera and Minerva, they can't fight the goddess Athena, because Athena was the protection for Troy. So they had been told this. And Helenus had told Hector and Priam, if you lose Athena from Troy, if you go against her, or she gets mad and she doesn't want to be here anymore and she leaves, we're dead. All of us are dead. So ultimately, when Helenus told Diomedes and Odysseus to go steal the palladium at the temple of Athena, he was telling them that they have to do a mantra like ritual of stealing the palladium, but ultimately Athena was the one who was up to it, who told Helenus. So Athena was also using Helenus. Minerva was using Helenus. Helenus was the messenger, and Helenus was trying to tell Troy that Athena must be kept and honored and respected. Even if you're fighting Minerva and Hera, make sure you don't fight Athena. They're all goddesses. And ultimately, the Trojans would have been not fighting Athena because Athena was a god that came from Zeus. She's the daughter of Zeus. So basically, Athena didn't have any feminine in her. Understand that all the goddesses are all feminine or mixtures of masculine and feminine and ruling a collective. And they all had collectives to rule. So in the collectives were not ruling themselves, or the collectives were not ruled by the collectives themselves. The collectives were ruled by the god or the goddess head themselves, who were in bodies that were immortal. So when the goddesses and gods died, the collectives were still alive in the humans. And so the spirit of the gods and goddesses went into the humans. When the goddess and god got murdered or killed, their spirit went all into the humans in their collective. So they didn't die. They ultimately live in the collective now of the humans that have those spirits. And ultimately, that's how they survive. The goddesses and gods are still alive in us today, even big time. But they've been diluted big time, diluted and mixed. And so it's very confusing to try to figure out how much of who you have or what. Helenus is innocent of any wrongdoing. He certainly did not betray Troy. He told Diomedes and Odysseus something that was a truth, that if they could steal the palladium, and that's if Athena lets them, and they couldn't steal it. Now, this is what Helenus knew. Understand that Helenus was a seer who had lots of secret information. He had lots of information and knowledge that he didn't share with others, but he did share when he could, and he wanted to share what he could. So he was actually not into hiding knowledge or not sharing it. He was actually more into being a friend, a loyal person, and trying to help. And he wanted to help the gods and goddesses resolve their dispute. So his whole reason to be alive and doing what he was doing was in honor of the gods and goddesses and being a loyal servant. He was trying to help everyone and resolve the conflict. It was his wish to not piss the gods off that were fighting each other. And it was too late because they were fighting. Zeus was had already, there was an attempt. Hera tried to overthrow Zeus even before Troy's walls were built. And ultimately, instead of killing her, Apollo tried to help. Poseidon was in on it, which means that the whole family tried to tie Zeus up and basically disempower him as the head god. So instead of killing them all, he actually punished them all. So Hera hung up in the heavens for a long time, upside down, screaming. So the goddess, the head goddess, she actually got tortured for a whole year, hanging upside down, screaming. A whole year. Ultimately, it was in punishment for what happened to Eris, and he got stuck in a box for a year, Pandora's box. Same idea. So basically, I think that's my opinion. Understand that I think Zeus stuck Hera up in the heavens and hung her upside down for a whole year as a punishment. Okay, now he also punished Apollo and Poseidon for being in on it. He turned them into humans. They knew who they were, but they lost their immortality. He turned them into humans, and he made them serve Troy and lived there for a year. During the time Apollo, the sun god, and Poseidon, the god of the sea, who was the brother of Zeus, when they got into when Helenus was only doing what Athena told him to do. Helenus was also doing what Minerva told him to do. So understand whatever Helenus was doing was being loyal to the gods and goddesses trying to help them resolve their conflict. Now, the problem is Minerva wanted to murder all the Trojans, including Helenus. So Minerva betrayed Helenus and had him go, well, she told him to go up and meet Diomedes and Odysseus to tell them what they have to do to make Troy come to terms. When Helenus realized that they weren't going to be able to save Troy, it's because the divine feminine collective coming from Minerva was so furious and so angry and so wanting revenge that the women actually murdered men by inviting them. These were Trojan women that behaved like monsters. It was from Minerva. So these Trojan women would do things like invite men over to a party, and then they would have 10 women talking to a man and ultimately invited him there for, drinks and fun. And ultimately, so they greet him and hi, and ultimately sit down with him, like 10 women, and they attack him with daggers and kill him. And ultimately, these were Trojan women that behaved that way. It came from Minerva and her anger, which means that because Minerva was angry at the egotistical behavior of the Trojan men and drinking, she ultimately had a huge problem with alcohol use. She hated alcohol. She can't stand alcohol. She doesn't drink. She'll never drink. And she hates alcohol. Like she wants to kill it. So ultimately she thinks men who drink are dirtbags because alcohol is just worthless and it makes you crazy. And ultimately it makes you kill yourself in your spirit, and it's just deadly. It's the worst, poison. So basically she completely hated alcohol. And men who drank it and acted stupid or did stupid things, she was very angry and unforgiving about it. Like if you're a drunk fool and you're drinking alcohol and you're going to be a drunk idiot and you're going to behave in a manner egotistically with your drunkenness, then I don't accept the behavior of men of Troy that are being stupid and drunk. Ultimately, it may have been some of them, but maybe some of them, enough of them, and Hector didn't absolutely jump in and stop those egotistical men of Troy, the egos that were being a little bit pompous. They were men that were actually not wrong. They were actually not wrong. They were trying to feel good about themselves, have pride and self-importance. And ultimately, that was their thing. You got to be self-important. You have to have a purpose, and you have to be important. You can't accept that you're not important, and ultimately, you must take your importance. And if you're not important, then what are you? Like, why are you even alive? Like, if you're not important, you don't have a reason to exist anyways. And so Trojan men were very self-pride, proud, and hopefully not haughty, but they probably weren't haughty, and maybe a few were, but not really. They were actually kind of proper, I think. I think Zeus approved of them, even in what they did wrong. The women were bad. So understand that the women were murderous, and they would actually be like, they would pretend to be a friend and murder you. And they did that to avenge a lot of the Trojan people that got killed. They behaved very badly. And even the gods and goddesses were shocked at Minerva was doing it. So Zeus was really pissed at Minerva for what the women of Troy and the collective were doing, where they were acting utterly not acceptable, which means that Troy had to be sacked, not because totally the men were being egotistical drunks and Hector wasn't doing anything about it. Hector accepted that men get drunk and act stupid, and it happens. Alcohol makes you do stupid things sometimes. But ultimately, Minerva didn't think it's an excuse. If you think it's okay to drink alcohol and be stupid sometimes, and you are stupid, but you're unforgivably stupid, alcohol will make you do really dumb things like rape people or absolutely want to kill your brother, or when you're drunk, you can really be stupid. And she just absolutely disapproved of any kind of behavior regarding alcohol. And Hector just wouldn't listen to her. Hector said, well, whatever, I'm not dealing with Minerva. I don't have Minerva, and she's a goddess. She can go away. Ultimately, I have Zeus and I have Mars, and Mars is my god, Hector would say. And ultimately, Helenus he didn't have Mars, but he would have taken him if he had him. He probably had him when he was fighting. So ultimately, he probably had Mars when he was fighting with Hector. So he probably liked it. So he probably liked fighting with Hector, only because it was camaraderie, and he got to take the spirit of Mars, the god, which meant that he went into battle fearless and tough and kick ass, not afraid, and could do it, survive in there. If you had a god in you, it empowered you, and ultimately it greatly empowered you. It made you strong, like you're not going to die, like you're invincible. And if you did die, it could happen, but ultimately, if a man was that competent, he probably didn't die. He probably actually, if he was that competent, he was that good, which meant that during the Trojan War, the egotistical behavior wasn't pompous or in any way kind of like not actually real, because the men who were egotistical were actually backing up what they said. They were as badass as they were pretending to be. They weren't pretending to be badass. They were badass. And so ultimately after Troy, that behavior continued in the collective. The egotistical behavior is in the collective of what's called Aries and Leo. And there's two collectives. One is seated in the fifth, and the other is seated in the first. Okay, thank you. The first and fifth are the collectives in the human realm that have the ego, and Leo has the ego that is mixed, and that's a different story. I'm talking about Helenus, but I want you just to know that the egotistical behavior comes from somewhere. It was in Troy. It came from the Trojan men. It had problems with drinking alcohol and its behavior, and how it got really bad, to where the goddess wanted to murder off every Trojan the bloodline. So Minerva got so mad, she wanted to murder the bloodline of Troy, kill every Trojan, including Helenus. But she pretended to be his friend, which meant that Helenus believed Minerva, that she was actually a goddess that liked him. She pretended to like him, or she acted not unfriendly. She said, "I need you to deliver some messages for me." So basically, he thought that she liked him. He thought he was doing a loyal service for her, and so she probably liked him. He thought he was going to help the war go the right way, and it would all end up well. But the truth is, Minerva was going to plan on killing him. And ultimately, what I'm going to tell you is the story that I have is that he did not make it to be a king. He did not end up in some land as a seer king that had survived the Trojan War and carried on the Trojan line. It's true, he did carry on the Trojan line, or at least there was a line that didn't die that came from him. I guarantee you there's one, which means that he did carry on the Trojan line, but the story says that he did as a king and as a survivor of the Trojan conflict, and he saw and survived the sack of Troy. It's not true. What really happened is he was captured by Diomedes and Odysseus, and he told them voluntarily, trying to help, meaning he was telling them everything he was telling them at the direction of Minerva and Athena. They were telling him, tell them. Athena said, tell them if they come steal the palladium, I'll go with them. So Athena had told Helenus, go tell Diomedes and Odysseus, if you go steal the palladium of Athena in the temple of Athena in Troy, if you can go there, sneak in there and steal it. It's just a little wooden statue. It's not even under a massive protection. It's been sitting in that temple. If you go steal it, I'll go with you. So when you take that palladium, if you want me, and you want me to help you, this is Athena talking. She's talking to Diomedes, the Achaeans and the Greeks and the Danaans, and specifically Diomedes and Odysseus. And she's saying, if you go steal my palladium there, but she couldn't tell Odysseus and Diomedes that, because actually that was something that Helenus was aware of. She told Helenus that. And ultimately, she didn't tell Diomedes or Odysseus anything, which means that Helenus had the information, and they wanted to get it out of Helenus. Now, it's strange why Athena didn't just go tell Diomedes, because she did talk to him. And it's ultimately in the whole story that 20 years and 10 years after the Trojan conflict it took for Odysseus to get home, Well, he talked to Athena and had her protection the whole time, which means that, but in the end, he didn't follow her and he started atheism. So atheism was started from Odysseus, the king of Ithaca. We didn't have any atheism in the world, and that's another story. Odysseus didn't believe Athena because she showed herself to be a god. And ultimately in the story, Athena is a god. So Odysseus thought he was following a god when he was following Athena, the goddess. Ultimately, he knew something was up. So in the story, you could say that Odysseus was aware that Athena was a goddess, and he was following her and taking her direction and getting help from her, and she was helping him during his 10-year thing. And that's another story. But it's important to mention Odysseus and Diomedes badly tortured in the worst imaginable ways, tortured and killed Helenus. So he didn't even see the end of the war. But the story, and the mythological story, says he was the only survivor and became king of some land, which now that's only because that was to honor him. So understand that the story is not true, but it is in truth what's supposed to have happened. So what I'm telling you is when you read the Iliad and you read the Aeneid, when you read these records of Homer and these stories of Homer, when you're reading about Helenus becomes king of Brotharum or I can't remember the cities, where he becomes slave. And Andromache, the wife of Hector, is also a slave to the son of Achilles, who actually killed Priam, his dad. So he was a slave. He ended up surviving and going with the guy who killed his father, beheaded him in a temple. It makes him look bad. Ultimately, in the story, it makes him look like a betrayer of Troy. And ultimately, he was not a betrayer of Troy, anything but, because what he was trying to do is help. He was trying to help Minerva, and Minerva was telling him instructions. Now, what got him literally killed? Well, understand, and Hermes ended up getting killed. Now, why did Hermes turn into Mercury? Well, understand that Hermes is actually called Mercury, as in the Roman version of what a god is. When he became the name Mercury, it's because he changed his whole personality. The personality of Hermes is really kind of different from the personality of Mercury. So the difference between Hermes, the god Hermes, who became the god Mercury. So in ancient Greece, Hermes was a plurality, and in ancient Rome afterwards, and it was Romanized, it became singularized. And so Mercury is a Hermes that is singular and singularized is and singularity, and not a plurality anymore. And ultimately, it could come in as a half or a whole that is whole, but it probably comes in as a half. And understand that because Hermes was you understand Hermes was a very important in between goddesses and men and gods. He was the messenger. So the goddess, and he had divine feminine, and ultimately Apollo didn't have divine feminine in him. He was just masculine. Hermes had feminine too. So Hermes took masculine and feminine, and he turned into a singular masculine as Mercury later because he lost his feminine. So the Roman god Hermes, called Mercury, lost his femininity. He got rid of it and ultimately became the god Mercury, not Hermes anymore. Hermes had the woman. He had her. But he got rid of her. He got rid of her because he got Romanized by the Romans, who became singularities. They went from plurality in Greek times, and which was accepted by the goddesses and gods, into a singularity, which was now accepted only by the gods. And the goddesses didn't accept the singularity, but they were no longer. The goddesses were all destroyed and killed and enslaved. They had no choice, and ultimately, whether the goddesses are alive and in prison somewhere, or whether they're dead as goddess heads and only surviving in the human collective, I don't know. What I have is probably that. Well, if they're hiding, if they're alive, they're not showing themselves. Utterly, they want people to think they're dead or gone or not there. And if they're not hiding themselves, then they are dead. And I'm told they are dead. Whether they're telling me that and it's not true, or I just look at both sides of it, understand that I'm not going to just take I don't literally believe anything. I believe everything and don't believe anything. So I basically take in the information and say, okay, it could be true, but if it's not true, what do I understand from it? And the understanding I get from it is proficient to be satisfied that I don't need to worry about the story's true or not, because what I'm being told in the story is an important something to learn. And ultimately, I don't focus on what's true about it. I focus on what it means and what it's telling me and what I could learn from it. It doesn't matter if it's true. If it's a story that's not true, I still learn a lesson from whatever the story is. And ultimately, the myth and the reality is mixed, meaning a lot of the myth stories are just, maybe they're not real, but they are real. And understand, I'm not going to say they're not real, because they are real. But the thing is, they're real in the spirit of the collective of the matter, in the spirit of the matter, and the substance of the spirit. So basically, this in the spirit, they're actually real, but not in any kind of tangible way, which means that you won't see it, you won't know it. In fact, you won't ever even think it. You won't know it's there unless somebody like me can point it out to you. You would never see it, ever. So you had no chance of even being witness to it. You'd think it didn't exist, it wasn't there, and there's nothing to look at. It's me pointing it out to you that you might grab a hold of it in some sense in the spirit and actually find it, see it, feel it, and then you have it as felt in the collective. You can learn from it then. Helenus was not anything more than a loyal, loving, kind, considerate, compassionate, friendly, willing, able, lovingly, very sincerely, a good man. And he would do anything to help somebody, especially the gods and goddesses. And he loved the goddesses and he wanted to help them. He certainly wanted to save Troy, and he certainly thought he could do it. So basically, Helenus was trying to be a hero. He was trying to save Troy. The thing is that when it went down, Troy got destroyed. Well, either he was already dead. That's the story I want to tell you, because Minerva tricked him into going to go get tortured by Diomedes and Odysseus, so that they got all the information on how to sack Troy. And he went and told them voluntarily, which means that they didn't have to torture him. But I think what I'm told is they did. They tortured him anyways and killed him anyways. And ultimately, he was voluntarily going to tell him. So Minerva tricked him into going up there. Now, Hermes got murdered by Athena because Hermes was up on the mountain pass going to warn Helenus and tell him. So the god Hermes was going to warn Helenus that Minerva is a lying goddess and she's setting you up. And he was up on the mountain pass waiting for Helenus to come up to the top so he could tell him, don't go to Odysseus and don't go to Diomedes. And ultimately, Athena saw Hermes up there and about to warn Helenus. Now, the whole sacking of Troy was up to Athena whether she wanted to sack Troy or not. She obviously did, because Athena wouldn't have let Minerva tell Helenus to go. And ultimately, Athena and Minerva are the same thing. But understand they're separate. Understand the spirit of Athena is not the spirit of Minerva. They're different because Athena doesn't have feminine in her. And ultimately, if Minerva is Athena, she's only half Athena, because she's half, she's Zeus. But Minerva is also from Zeus. But Minerva actually has Hera, which means that Athena doesn't have Hera. She doesn't have a feminine goddess in her. She's a goddess that's a god. And so basically the difference between Athena and Minerva is there's a huge difference. And if you didn't know, you certainly wouldn't know, which means that you would never be able to know any of this unless you did. You certainly wouldn't figure it out. If Athena came to you, the goddess Athena, you would have thought it was a god coming to you. You would have felt a masculine presence there. So you would have felt Zeus. And you also might have felt some hint of feminine, because she was a goddess. So she had the hint of feminine was not really there. It was more like, since she was a goddess, it was a god, then you felt the god, but then it was a goddess though. So it was a strange feeling of like, what is that? Like, is that Athena? Yeah, that feels like, I don't understand. Like, what is that? Ultimately, yeah, people would be confused feeling Athena, but they feel a powerful god there. So they would be respectful. Now, Minerva would come to you feeling like a goddess. You'd feel the feminine Hera mother. And So he knew the difference between both of them, but ultimately he was listening to Minerva trying to help her. So he thought he was going to save Troy. So he went up there. He wanted to go tell Diomedes and Odysseus everything, because if Troy can get sacked, then the lines of Troy, the bloodlines of Troy, were going to restart Troy, and they had killed all the bad Trojans that they didn't want to survive. So Zeus's will, and ultimately the will of Apollo and Artemis, was out of the picture, but so was Apollo. Understand that the will of Zeus was not to kill Enos, who's a Trojan, whose mother was Venus. So Enos was a Trojan who started Rome later. So Enos survived the war and became the new Rome. And supposedly Helenus survived the war and became a new king of many lands, and ended up with Hector's wife, Andromache. I beg to differ. Now, understand, if I ever found out that actually I'm wrong, it's only because when I'm telling you that these are alternate endings, it's important you know that in one of the alternate endings, Helenus does not survive. He gets tortured and killed by Diomedes and Odysseus. And ultimately, that ending, I'm going to tell you, that's the ending I think happened for real. And ultimately, in the myth, it says he survived and was a victor and went on to be a king of many lands and all this stuff. So it was supposed to be a happy, good thing in the end, but he was a betrayer of Troy, right? No, he wasn't. He was trying to help the gods and goddesses, literally. He was doing what they wanted. He didn't really know what was going to happen, but the goddesses said, tell them how to sack Troy so we can get rid of all the people in Troy that are not going to cooperate. And we don't want that line to survive ever. We're going to kill it off. But Helenus didn't really know all these details. He also didn't think that Minerva wanted to kill him or his bloodline. He thought that there was guilty Trojans that needed to die. And ultimately, he agreed that, yeah, if they're not going to follow the goddesses, they're going to die. Ultimately, he did follow the goddesses, so it was why they're going to die. The Trojan men that refused to follow the goddesses, Zeus didn't punish them because Zeus was aware that they were against Minerva, who he called the vixen daughter, and he had threatened to kill her. So Zeus threatened to kill Minerva, his daughter, who was a goddess. In fact, I think he did. So she ended up dead with a lightning bolt. I believe it happened when Odysseus got home 10 years after the war, or it happened right after the sacking of Troy or during. But I don't know the exact time that Minerva got a lightning bolt up her butt. But Zeus, I think, killed his daughter, Minerva, destroyed her because he thought she had to die. She was a vixen, bad woman who would trick a man and pretend to like him and then absolutely betray him by stabbing him with a dagger. And ultimately, the women of Troy were behaving like monsters. So they actually said the women of Troy were monsters, demon monsters. The women were just, they would lie, tell you, act like they're your friend and murder you, poison you. They would absolutely do anything. There was nothing they wouldn't do if they felt like it. And ultimately, it was because Minerva was so determined to absolutely win that she was just wanting to murder all the men of Troy in their collective. Helenus was not guilty of anything but being a great man and a hero. He certainly tried to be a hero. He wanted to be a hero. He was egotistical. Certainly, he had an ego. He liked his ego. He thought he wanted to be important and have a purpose. So he felt like he was saving the world or saving Troy, and it was because of his relationship with goddess Minerva, who he directly talked to. He directly talked to Apollo, the god of the sun, so he knew him personally. And Apollo, he was a high priest. He was the pope of Apollo and Artemis. So, I mean, he knew those gods and goddesses. They showed themselves and talked to him every day, which meant that he it was like the Pope. He was like the Pope back then, and to Apollo, the son of the one God that's today is alive. Now, Apollo's not alive. I'll tell you that I think Apollo's dead. I also am pretty sure Artemis is dead, but Zeus is not dead, and his name is Jehovah now, and his name is Jehovah. So Jehovah is Zeus, and he calls himself a different by Jupiter, relation to Jupiter, certainly, but it's actually not Jupiter, and it's not Zeus. It's now Jehovah. Jehovah is not Yahweh, but it's Jehovah, and Yahweh is, I think, Jesus Christ, but I'm not even sure of that because I don't know much about Christianity and as far as the, well, yeah, I mean, yeah. So now, when Jesus Christ comes in, it changes everything, the whole ball game. So it's not supposed to be a ball game, and the competition is not supposed to be so competitive. And ultimately, Troy had a competitive structure, a competing society, man against woman, one against the other, and ultimately it was supposed to be supportive competition. Ultimately, they were very much into competing and with each other, against each other, and also be in relations of friendliness. It didn't work, meaning that in the end, by not cooperating or pretending to cooperate, or even in some form of cooperation where you're competing and also against who you're cooperating with, it certainly ruins everything. And it makes false friends, false relationships, false realities, and false worlds. False people and falseness causes plagues, disasters, and death of people and their societies. The gods punish us still today when we're bad, and we don't even know what bad is. It might be bad to be good, and ultimately being good might be bad. But ultimately, I just want you to think about that. Is the kind of insights you'll get from me are think about if you found out that being good was really not good. That in fact, being good is allowing things to stay the same when that should be changed, and not stepping up and calling them out. By just being good and accepting what is when the God wants it different, and that means you're not doing what the God wants. You're actually doing what the society wants, and the will of man fights the will of God as a collective. It also tries to represent it, which means that to fight God at the same time you're trying to represent it, and then you're actually being it, against it, for it, as it, against it, with it, not against it. It's a very contradicting, hypocritical feeling of poisonous spirit. And it is, meaning you won't want to be, maybe you don't want to be good sometimes because maybe you should be bad and like it. And what that means is that that's not literal. That's what God would tell you. I want you to think about that. And I'm not telling you to be bad. What I'm telling you is just think about it. Think about the idea that you don't even know what good is, but it's not good. And if you were good, you would be willing to be bad, because God can't use you unless you're bad. And ultimately, if you're good, you're doing what man wants in man's will and in man's society. And men are not doing the will of God; they're doing the will of man. Ultimately, there's only one God now, because the rest of them are dead. So what happened is that there was a declaration of the Catholic Church, and it was only one God suddenly one day. So they became aware. There was hundreds of goddesses and gods, but most of them were called lesser goddesses and lesser gods. They were all powerful in spirit. Some were mortal, and some of them were immortal. A human could be immortal, and also not a god, but a god is immortal and not a human. And so when you get immortality, it doesn't mean you're a god. You could be a human that has immortality, so lives forever, but is not a god, is a human. But a god is immortal and has immortality and is not a human. It's confusing, the truth, because you wouldn't see it. You certainly wouldn't know it, and you couldn't figure it out unless you could actually know it and perceive it. The difference between being immortal as a human or immortal as a god who's not human. They're both immortal. One of them's an immortal human, and the other one's an immortal god who's not human. You understand? And there's only one immortal god that's not human, that could be anywhere in the collective. And the rest of them are, if they're immortals, they're humans, not God. Well, they might have the God, but they're not. It's like an original, and then you've got all the copies. The original is not the copy, and you can't call the original a copy. It's not a copy of anything. It's an original, and there's only one original, and the rest of them are copies of the original. So the original has many, many copies. The copies are supposed to be copying, so they're not bad for copying. They're actually supposed to copy because they're supposed to do it. They're supposed to get their substance from the original. Ultimately, it becomes portraying a character, not really copying. Apollo, the sun god, and he was fair, the fairest. Apollo, the sun god, was fair and just, and a good, loving god who cared about his people a lot. He not only cared about his people, but Helenus got his the attitude and his character from Apollo. And Apollo, so basically Helenus was trying to be like Apollo and Artemis. So he had a lot of the goddess in him. And ultimately maybe the goddess first. He was trying to represent the divine feminine, the collective, as a high priest, as a pope. So he could do it, and he did it for a long time. And ultimately it could go bad and wrong because if the collective gets upset and he can't calm it down, then he has to detach from it and disconnect. And ultimately, then there's no heading the collective. Then that collective heads itself based upon whatever it's doing as a group, which means that the collective is very chaotic in its behavior. It could be very chaotic and turn into chaos because if there's no godhead or goddess head to rule the collective, and that's what's supposed to happen. There's supposed to be a goddess body and a goddess that's real, or a god body and a god that's real, that has a body, that is a god. And there's only supposed to be one of them. And they're supposed to be actually in a body that's immortal, and it's actually not human. And then it's supposed to walk around and you see God. And he's actually like 10 feet tall, or he's bigger than a human, meaning Apollo, all the gods and goddesses were much bigger than a human. They could have been 15, 20 feet tall, but ultimately they were much bigger. So you would have seen a giant coming at you when it was a god or goddess. As hard as that is to believe, understand, they were bigger than humans. They were specifically bigger. There was also giants that played gods and ultimately had gods. Helenus was cheated from his right to be honored as a highly honorable pope of the gods and goddesses and the most loyal servant to the god Zeus, the only one god, and any other god or goddess that came to him. He tried his best to be a middleman between gods and goddesses who fought. So he was a messenger between Minerva and Hector and Priam. He loved to do it. He loved Minerva, and he didn't know Minerva hated him because she acted nice, and she was just telling him to deliver these messages. So he thought he was doing some job for Minerva, and she liked him. But the truth is, I think she didn't like him. She wanted him dead too. And ultimately, if I'm wrong, then understand what I'm being told is the story goes that Minerva didn't like him. She thought he should die like the rest of them. It's also why eventually she would end up dead, because Zeus would kill Minerva and either imprison Hera forever or kill her goddess head body. And basically, the Hera is alive in the humans today, in the collective of the divine feminine. It's a collective in spirit. It's a spiritual collective that's alive. It's a spirit that lives, and it causes the women to feel all at once, which means all the feelings of the women they're collective. It's as a group. Whatever it is, it's what's left of the goddess. Doesn't have a goddess head there that's actually sentient, that knows anything. The collective is ruling itself by whatever it's doing and feeling whatever it's feeling, and then responding and reacting to its own feelings. So basically, it's very possible the collectives are chaotic and going off the hook and going right and left like firestorms. Yeah, like it's not good. There needs to be a head of the collectives that is ruling them somehow, that is keeping them in order, having the information they need, sharing the information that's important, so they've got what they need and they're calm, and they're able to cooperate calmly. And ultimately, to calm the collective down is very difficult. It's very much in a panic, trying to take some order. It's the goddess that's dead, and she's trying to reestablish herself. But since she's dead, or she's only living in the collective, there's no woman that is actually able to take her as her, because they're all trying it. But ultimately, as a group, they're trying to reestablish the goddess head. It's ultimately not going to work because there is no goddess head. It's also why it's chaotic. So the collective is not even aware that it's influencing itself and reacting to itself, being controlled by itself, and the chaos is controlling it, as well as anything good that it does. So it could actually control itself and actually do something if it knows. But the collective would have to be aware. So understand that women don't even know any of this. They certainly don't know that the way they feel as a group is a group, felt as a spiritual substance, essence in a group, a collective of women. Okay, I guess I'm done. Poor Helenus. He got labeled by some people as they thought that he was a traitor or betrayer of Troy. He was not. He was a hero of Troy that tried to save the world. He tried to save Troy. He did his best. And ultimately, he got betrayed by Minerva, the goddess. He got killed by Diomedes and Odysseus and tortured to death. When he was going to tell him anyways, he was trying to help Athena and Minerva win the war, because he thought that the goddesses and the gods have to come together. They can't. If it ends up with the one god in the end, it was like the world ended. Because if the goddesses got killed off, then there's only one god, and he doesn't have any goddesses. That means he killed his whole family. So understand, if the god Zeus killed his whole family, because they did try to overthrow him, and they did try to actually kill him in the past. Understand, his family, the gods and goddesses fought and tried to take over each other. Hera tried to kill Zeus, and ultimately he didn't kill her for trying to kill him. He got saved by the Hecatoncheires and ultimately set free. So they tried to actually, I don't know if they're going to kill him, but they tried to tie him up and constrict him so they could control him and imprison him. But he called the Hecatoncheires for help, and they came. Lucky for him. And ultimately the Hecatoncheires were strong to destroy everyone ran. Apollo had to run, Poseidon ran. They couldn't fight the Hecatoncheires. They were badass. So they set Zeus free. So Zeus already had a problem with his family. He already threatened to kill his wife. He already threatened to kill his vixen daughter, Minerva. And ultimately he told them they're not in charge. Athena is in charge. So Athena is ruling. And so ultimately Athena, who they think is Minerva, who might be, except the thing is Minerva's masculine and feminine. And Athena doesn't have any feminine. Athena's just a god. Minerva is a goddess, not a god. And ultimately, but also Athena is a goddess, but not a goddess, because she's actually a goddess. But when you look at it like that, she doesn't have feminine. Athena has only her dad Zeus in her. She is from her dad. She came from his forehead, which means that Minerva came from Hera, or from whoever her mother was, from Hera. So ultimately, it could have been some other mother that wasn't Hera, but it was the same divine feminine energy, which is the same thing Hera has. So it's divine feminine and divine masculine. It's in all of them. The story is ultimately sad because Helenus, well, they wrote a good ending, which means that the whoever Homer wrote the story of the Trojan War, he honored the memory of Helenus by putting him in the myth, saying that he became the king of many lands, but he didn't. He got tortured and killed. He didn't even live to see this Troy fall. So ultimately, the entire story of the Iliad concerning Helenus was made up. Now, the reason why it was made up is a good reason, which means that I'm not upset and calling it a lie. What I'm doing is I'm proud of it, saying, isn't it nice that Homer put Helenus in the story like it was supposed to happen, by writing the story as it was supposed to happen. But the way that it really happened was not the way the story goes. And ultimately, the story tells you how it was supposed to be. And ultimately, what happened actually was not how it was supposed to be. It was actually what it wasn't supposed to be. He didn't deserve death. He didn't deserve to be killed. He didn't deserve to be tricked and lied to by the divine feminine who led him into a slaughter. He didn't deserve to be called a traitor or betrayer because he was trying to help the goddess and do what they wanted. So he was actually being a high priest of Pope, doing his duty. So he was not betraying anything. And ultimately, Athena was the one who told him to tell them, if they can take me from the Palladium, they can steal it. If they get away with me, it's because I went with them. And if I don't go with them, they're going to go there and try to steal that Palladium, and they ain't going to be able to do it because they'll get caught. So ultimately, that's why he had Diomedes and Odysseus had to go steal the Palladium. So Helenus told them, if you can take that Palladium, it's Athena herself. She says, come get me. If you can get away with it, if you don't get caught, you could steal it. If you could actually steal Athena, it's because she'll let you, which means that when you get to that temple and you want to steal that Palladium statue, if Athena actually approves of you, because she'll look at you and say, I wonder if I'm going to go with you or not. Ultimately, Athena was wanting to leave Troy. She was going to backstab the Trojans because she thought the women were monsters, and they were Minerva, who was a vixen, they called her, and Athena was the only one in charge, and Minerva was not supposed to be in charge, and ultimately was taking charge and ultimately conducting warfare, which meant that she was going against her dad's will. Minerva was going against the will of Zeus. Athena was trying to follow the will of Zeus. And ultimately, Zeus approved of Athena because she was him. And he didn't approve of Minerva because she had Hera. And he didn't approve of Hera because she was Hera. So basically, Zeus didn't approve of his wife or even trust her. She tried to kill him in the past. He hung her upside down for a year and tortured her. She was mad about that, meaning he let her free after that. So understand that she was really messed up and pissed at him. So like the fact that he even let her live after he tortured her for a year, she was really disturbed by it. So even the goddesses and gods can get disturbed. Eros got locked in a box for maybe forever, but Pandora opened it. And ultimately there's a story about Eros getting locked in a box, the spirit of the singularity of the masculine, the demon spirit of Eros gets locked in a box. Zeus locks him in the box and says, you're never getting out. He gives the box to a woman who might have been like Pandora, and he says, don't ever open this box ever, or you'll let out everything that's not good. and don't open it because there's also good things in there that might be beautiful. And so basically, he set up by giving her that box and saying, don't open it, and telling her whatever he told her, it made her curious as to want to open it. So it was the whole plan to get her to open it. And Eris would be in the box talking to her, saying, please let me out, please let me out. And ultimately she'd feel it. Wouldn't hear his voice, but she'd feel him saying, like, let me out, I'm stuck in a box. I'm here forever if you don't let me out, please. And ultimately, it took a whole year before he got sincere. So that's a different story. But understand that when Eris got locked into a box, that was the god of war who got locked into a box. And he stayed there for an entire year like it was a room. He was in a room. It was a box, but he was in a room, full-size room, and stuck in it. And he couldn't eat. There was no windows in the room. He couldn't see nothing. It was dark, pitch black, and he was alive, and he was immortal, and he was a god, and he was stuck in a box. And he was begging to get out of the box. Please let me out, please. And ultimately, the plan Zeus had for locking him in that box was if he doesn't get sincere with her, he'll be in that box forever. And if she lets him out, it's because she wants to let him out. Even if she don't even know that he's in there, he is in there. And even if she doesn't know what he's telling her, he's talking to her and she feels it. She doesn't hear it, which means that he's talking to her feelings and she's going to feel it. What she's doing is looking at that box, feeling like, damn, what is going on? I want to open that box. I don't even know Eris is in there. The demon spirit, singularity. Yeah, that's why you don't open it. It'll be stuck in there forever. But ultimately, when she lets Eris out of the box, she lets Eris into the box. Because when Eris gets out of the box, he gets into her, which means the spirit of Eris, when you open the box, it possesses her right away. So she takes on the spirit of, she gets possessed by Eris, the demon god, who's just a singularity. You call him a demon, but he's just a singularity. It's not like, what is it, a demon? Like, what's a demon? It's a singularity. Okay, but is singularity evil? No, it's a singularity. It might be like tough as hell, or maybe in your face, or kicking ass. But yeah, it might try to win and tell you it's better or stronger or back off. But ultimately, it could be combative. Singularity is going to try to rule and say it's the boss, the king. It'll claim it, and you can't really do much. Well, you can fight it, call it a demon, and try to kill it, or just don't cooperate with it, tell it to go off and get away from me. Ultimately, it'll cause problems. The whole world's full of problems because we're fighting demons when we don't even know what demons are. We're fighting God, and we don't even know who God is. And when we know who God is, we will say we don't know who God is, or we at least didn't before. So understand that when you know who God is, you'll certainly say to yourself, well, I didn't know who God was. Wow. You'll be shocked. And then you'll get over the shock and you say, wow, God's not anything like I thought he was going to, like I pictured him to be. Well, he's a loving grandfather up in heaven, but down on earth, he's more of a version of his sons who are gods of this world. So understand there's two gods that are one God of this world, and they claim to be gods of this world. So whether they are or not, they're the ones that answer your prayers. So if you pray and they actually answer your prayers, then understand that you are going to be perceiving them to be talking to you and telling you something. If you don't talk to God and you don't hear his voice in your head, then you must assume that either God's not talking to you or you can't tell what he's saying, because God will talk to your feelings and your heart and leave your ego out of it, which means that when God talks to you, he talks to your heart and your feelings, which means you won't know what he's saying. You certainly have no idea. But what you'll feel is like, okay, if God was talking to me, what would he be saying? Well, you won't know, but you'll feel whatever you feel. And so you could guess, and maybe you're right, but ultimately it might not even be God talking to you. Maybe you're just thinking it is, and it's not God. So maybe it's you talking to yourself, or maybe some other spirit. So you don't know. So ultimately, when you do know God, because he does talk to you, you'll be not mistaking it. And, using the right hand, not to confuse or contort the spirit of the demon or the singularity, but the right hand of God that is actually authenticating a message. And ultimately, that means you have to authenticate a message with God. You have to be talking to him and know that he's talking to you. You can't not be aware of what he's saying. So you have to be having a tangible experience with God. Otherwise, it's intangible, and it's not. You might as well assume it's not happening. Well, you can't really assume that God's talking to you if you don't hear nothing or sense anything. And if you guess by your feelings, it's possible you can, but understand that interpreting feelings is not easy. And so to know what God's talking to you or telling you when he's only talking to your heart and he won't include your ego or your mind or head. So then you have to interpret the feelings. It's really difficult to do. You have to have someone skilled at interpreting feelings. And if they can do it, they can do it. So it's very possible that when God's not going to really talk to you anything but your heart, you can interpret the feelings and know what he's saying. And each person will interpret them different. And the problem is that there's too many differences in the interpretations in the high priests that we're trying to interpret these messages. So let's talk about for a minute why God would stop let's talk about why God would stop sharing his presence with the human, or why he would withdraw his presence from the human race. Well, God would withdraw his presence from the human race. He did. And he told the humans when he withdrew his presence utterly from the entire world, he took himself away from the humans and he said, "You're never going to see me again. You will never know me again like you know me now. You will never see me again. But I will talk to your heart and tell you and instruct you what to do. And your high priest can interpret whatever I'm saying. And ultimately, what I'm going to do is confound you and confuse you, because you're now going to be, I don't even see God anymore. He's not here. Right. He left. He's gone. So he was here, but now he's not. So understand that we all think that like God is here and he's not here. If he's here, he's not here, I guarantee you. And if he is here, then he's somewhere else, and he's here in spirit, which means that he's not here in his body, and he has a body. God's not dead. Okay, that's pretty much it. We'll start another one. I'll see you in a minute.